So, all right. So today I'm going to be talking about gathering herbs ethically and sustainably from your environment. So this is a really kind of a complicated topic. So what I'm going to do today is a fairly not too in-depth introduction to it. It's going to be kind of a basic introduction to it. Hang on a second. I think I need to switch to not Wi-Fi. Okay. I think that will work better. I'm not sure. No, maybe not. I'm still getting some echoes.
Could you mute all attendees? 'Cause I think there's feedback coming through.
Let's see. All right, hopefully that's better. I don't know. So I want to talk about gathering herbs sustainably and ethically. And that means a lot of things. But the main thing that means is not taking more than the environment will support. That's the kind of primary thing that you need to be aware of, is what the ecology that you're taking the things from will support, and what the ecological impact is going to be of the amount that you're taking. Because no matter how much you are taking, there's going to be some sort of an ecological impact, and that's going to be different depending on how much we're talking about. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how you go about that. And keep in mind that some medicinal plants are much more environmentally sensitive than others. There are some things, of course, like dandelions, that it's hard to kill off even if you mean to. And there are some things that are very easy that would be very easy to overharvest or to destroy a population of without intending to. So for the most part, I'm going to talk about some sort of guidelines for things that are just sort of in the middle there, not the extremely environmentally sensitive stuff, which you probably shouldn't even harvest in most cases, and not the things that are super weedy, although we will talk a little bit about that too. So yeah, one of the main ways that people have gone about sourcing medicinal plants, and probably the oldest way that people have gone about sourcing them, is going out and finding them in their natural habitat and harvesting a small portion of what's growing there for use. And this is something that people still do all over the world. And, you know, we have this sort of paradigm that we're taught in school that people used to be hunters and gatherers, and then the agricultural revolution came along and changed everything, and since then people have been, you know, civilized or whatever. And that's kind of like something that people who lived like that decided was the right way, and decided to tell the story that way. But the truth is that people still hunt and gather all over the world, and it's still a big source of food for a lot of people and for a lot of communities and a lot of cultures, and it is still a very large source of herbal medicines. And within the herbal world, there are some people who kind of feel like you shouldn't harvest anything from the wild. I kind of completely disagree with that. I think that that's a very well, that works out well for the people who own land, but not necessarily for everybody else. So, you know, this is one of gathering wild plants is one of humanity's oldest cultural traditions. And I think that it just needs to be done in a way that is culturally and environmentally sensitive and not destructive and not exploitative. Sometimes people will go into an area where there's a plant that they can sell and gather as much of it as they possibly can, sell it for a quick profit, and then they don't care about what happens to the stand of plant after that. And that's kind of, that's a bad way to do things. So I'm going to talk about the opposite of that, which is developing a relationship with the stand of plants, with community of plants, and so forth, and using that relationship to provide yourself and the people around you with medicine. Just in general, certain plant parts are more susceptible to overharvesting than others. If you're gathering fruits, for instance, fruits are basically designed to leave the plant. So, usually it's not as big of a deal to harvest fruits. Of course, if you harvest all of them, or if you harvest enough of them that no new plants are forming, then that can be a problem. But for the most part, it's not a direct threat to a stand of plants to harvest fruit from them. What it is, though, sometimes is disruptive to the other animals and other components of the ecosystem that rely upon those fruits. So, for instance, if you go to a stand of oak trees and you gather every single acorn there, it won't really harm the oak trees, but it'd be bad for the squirrels, right? It'd be bad for the deer, because that's a big part of what they eat and a big part of how they get through the winter. So, and then if the squirrels and the deer are gone, that's going to have an impact on the forest as well, eventually including the population of the oaks. But since individuals live for maybe, hundreds of years, if no mischance befalls them, then, it won't have any sort of direct immediate impact on the stand in your lifetime, probably. But it can have an impact on the other plant communities around. It can change the soil chemistry. It can change what's going on in the streams. And of course, it can change the population of the animals that would eat the acorns, and then the population of the animals that would eat those animals. So it's important to consider that sort of thing when you're gathering fruits. And that's, kind of one of the main sort of things that you would want to consider when you're gathering any sort of seed-bearing part of a plant is, who else needs this besides you? And what might you be doing about it? Under the best case scenario with a wild plant, I don't think you should harvest more than half of what's out there. And of course, not everybody does that. A lot of people, if they go blackberry picking, they'll pick every blackberry they see. And, when the birds come along, they'll pick every blackberry that they see. And the bears will do the same. So that's not terrible with blackberries, but because blackberries don't necessarily even always need their fruits to propagate, and they produce a lot of them. So, but in general, just as a sort of guideline to make sure that you're on the good side of not causing too much environmental disruption, don't harvest more than half of any sort of fruit that you're harvesting to use for medicine. Some of the medicinal fruits that I harvest around this time of year would include blackberries and raspberries, mulberries. So there's a whole lot of things that are black walnuts are coming ripe in the next few weeks. They'll start falling from the trees, and they're a type of fruit. They're a nut encased in a green hull, and that's a medicinal plant that we'll be talking about later and later today. And so that's the same guideline. Fruit is not especially impactful when you harvest it, but it is something you should leave at least half of. And of course, in the case of black walnuts, if you go and find a stand of black walnuts, half of the walnuts from one tree would be like, probably 10-gallon, two 5-gallon buckets, way more than you're going to need if you're just doing, herbalism on a small scale, on a clinical scale, rather than, mass producing tinctures or something like that. So it's very easy to not harvest too much of that sort of thing. There are other plants like tea berry, for instance, that there aren't nearly as many of. When you find a stand of them, you'll find, maybe you'll find a couple hundred plants, and maybe a third of those plants will have fruit on them, even in the season where there is fruit. So you're not going to find giant amounts of it. But that differs a lot from plant to plant. Leaves are not as low impact to harvest as fruits, but they are less of an impact to harvest than some other plant parts. So if you're just harvesting leaves, and I'm talking about not harvesting the whole above ground part of the plant, but just picking leaves off of a plant, in a scenario where that's what you're doing, then probably don't want to take more than a third of it. And that's, depending on what you're harvesting. Again, the main plant that I harvest where I'm going out and picking leaves off of the plant is raspberry leaf. And so that's, something we've talked about before, a plant that we've talked about before. And, I would maybe harvest the leaves from a third of the plants. Depending on what the plant is and how many leaves it has and that sort of thing, there are two ways you can go about this. With raspberry, it might be easy to just go up to a single cane of raspberry and pull all the leaves off of that particular cane, and do that with about a third of the canes that are in a stand. And, that's not going to drastically affect the health of the stand. Another way to do it would be to, if you had, say, a small bush of some sort that you were picking the leaves off of, or maybe a pine tree, you would pick the leaves from a small amount of the leaves from a particular plant. Now, a pine tree, most of the leaves are going to be up where it's very hard for you to reach. So sometimes what people will do is cut down a branch and take the leaves off of that branch. And then also to harvest the bark and the sap from the branch and things like that. And that's kind of the more practical thing to do there than to just rent a cherry picker and pick off the leaves from all over the 100-foot tall tree or whatever. It wouldn't be very feasible at all. So just harvesting a branch and getting a bunch of the leaves off of that is often a good way to do that. But you have to be careful of that. You don't want to take a whole lot of branches from one tree, and you don't want to take branches from a whole lot of trees in the same area, because anytime you cut a tree, there's a chance that it's going to end up leading to fungal infection or decay or something like that. And on the chance that happens, you don't want to be doing it to a lot of trees. You want to leave most of them completely untouched. So leaves are something that a lot of plants you can harvest large amounts of leaves from. A lot of the plants that we harvest for leaves specifically are plants that you can harvest a lot of leaves from pretty easily. And in the case of raspberries, they're one of the ones that are very prolific producers. They do a lot of vegetative reproduction, where they grow not from seeds but from existing plants. So you can get a large amount of most of your leaf type medicines pretty easily, and usually with not a lot of environmental impact, not a lot of destruction of plants. You don't necessarily have to cost the lives of entire plants to pick leaves. Moving up the scale a little bit would be plants where we're harvesting the aerial part of the plant. So this is the case for a lot of herbs, and this is sort of the usual thing as far as picking herbs goes, is you're harvesting the above ground part of the plant. And that would apply to most of your mints, nettles, chamomile, all kinds of things like that. You're not taking the roots, so you're not necessarily killing the plant, depending on what kind of plant it is. But you are taking the above ground part of the plant, which is means that the plant is not necessarily going to bear fruit that year, or that particular stem of it isn't, and it's not going to that part of the plant is not going to be available for propagation through non-seed means, like runners and things like that, that would involve the above ground parts of the plant. So it's not as available to gather energy, because, and this is a case with the leaves too, but especially with the whole above ground part of the plant, where there are, you're basically taking the plant out of circulation for that particular year. And for some plants, they'll come back the next year, and for some plants, they only live 1 year. So depending on what kind of plant it is, harvesting the above ground part can be a pretty big impact. And so usually, depending on the plant, if it's a prolific grower, I would still say about 1 plant in 3. If it's kind of average, more like 1 in 5 at the most. And usually you want to find a healthy stand where you don't even need that much of it. But that's kind of like the theoretical maximum of what you should ever harvest from a plant stand, is about 1 in 5 if it's kind of an average yielding plant. Now, that being said, there are a lot of plants that are invasive and that you don't necessarily want to conserve in your environment. Japanese knotweed is a good example of a plant that people use medicinally that is generally in this part of the world considered a problem. It's a large invasive plant that spreads and shades out other plants and keeps native plants from growing. And it's very common in disturbed ground, very common around human habitations and human constructions and things like that. And so if you harvest every one of those, no one's going to mind. It's usually going to be, rather better than if you didn't. So that's, a difference from a plant that you're actually trying to harvest sustainably. You might be trying to harvest it to eradication because it's problematic for you. And, there are a few plants like that. There might also be areas like that where, for example, you want to till up your garden, so you harvest everything that's in that area. And maybe there would be plants that, if you were coming upon them in an area that you weren't about to plow under, you would not harvest all of them, but that anything that's going to be there is just going to be tilled or whatever. You could go ahead and take whatever's there. So that's kind of, a choice that you make sometimes. And then barks and roots are even more destructive, basically, even more high costs to the plant communities that you're taking them from. So just a second. Yeah, so with barks, you kind of have to assume that there's a good chance that, the barks are kind of similar to what I said about the leaves. You can take a lateral branch and harvest the bark from it and not have to worry so much about damaging the rest of the tree beyond the fact that you've pruned a limb off of it. So that's one way of harvesting. And another way of harvesting is to take an entire small tree and take the bark from that. So if you were harvesting sassafras, for instance, sassafras is a plant in the laurel family. Got a chicken. Sassafras is a plant in the laurel family that is harvested for tea, and people use it to sort of purify the blood, is the traditional explanation of it. You take the tea and it maybe moves the lymph in your body and makes the liver and spleen a little more active. And so that's something that people take as a sort of spring tonic in this part of the country on a fairly regular basis. I mean, a lot of people do that once a year or so, the third week in February. So if you're harvesting sassafras, usually it's a very small tree. Most of the sassafras you find is a very small tree, and you can just, if you're harvesting it in the spring while the sap's running and you're harvesting the bark, you can cut a small tree down and peel all the bark off of that small tree. And when I say a small tree, I mean something like a sapling, something like, you know, maybe bigger around than a broom handle, but not as big around as a baseball bat. And then peel the bark off of that, and you know, that will be enough to make tea for lots of people out of. It's also an ingredient in root beer. So that's one way of doing it, is to you can either sacrifice a branch, or you can sacrifice a small tree and get a similar amount of bark. With the small tree thing, you know, that tree's definitely cut down. With the large tree thing, you know, there is always some risk, but hopefully not a lot, to the larger tree by pruning it that way. So just depending on what kind of tree you're getting. So for example, I always do sassafras the way that I just described for sassafras. I always do slippery elm by cutting a lateral branch, cutting a branch instead of cutting down the whole tree. Because most of the slippery elm that I encounter, well, there's not so much of it in the woods, and so if there's a large tree, I don't want to damage that. If there's a small tree, I want to let it grow in the hopes that it becomes a large tree. So that's you know, two different ways. I kind of think of it as the way that cutting down the whole tree is the way that beavers harvest bark. Sacrificing a branch is the way the porcupines harvest bark. They climb up on the tree and they eat the bark off of the branch, and the beavers, you know, they chew the tree down, and then they eat everything off of a more limited number of trees, or a more limited volume of trees. Just a second. To come home, so I'm outside of my house instead of at the clinic. Things are a little more chaotic here. All righty then. So yeah, and then so with bark, you know, you really do have to be careful, because if you are working with trees can live a long time, and if you do something wrong, it can have an impact for a long time. So that's you know, something to be aware of when harvesting bark. It's not something you want to do very recklessly. Cherry is another bark that I usually harvest, and you can do cherry either of the two ways. I like cherry bark from small trees better, so I usually, and it because it's like a stone fruit that's distributed by birds who eat the seeds. There are a lot of weed-like cherry trees around, so I often will get some of those, get a couple of those, and peel them, and dry the bark, and then I have a nice little bale of bark that I can use for a year or so from two trees that are, you know, about that big around. It's not one that I use a ton, but it's something that I use fairly regularly. And Kim has something she's telling us. Laurel wilt is a newly discovered fungus that was recently detected in southwestern Kentucky, which affects sassafras. Yeah, it's a disease that affects the leaves, and I'm not exactly sure what the best practices are on management of that, but you wouldn't want to bring any part of a plant that seemed to be affected by that in contact with any part of a plant that was not, or around other plants that weren't. So that's something to be careful of and be aware of. So the yeah. And then moving up the scale from bark, there's a matter of roots and rhizomes, the underground parts of the plant. And if you're harvesting roots, you know, generally speaking, you're killing that individual plant. If you're harvesting a rhizome, which is sort of like an underground modified stem that's part of the root system, it sort of grows mostly sideways underground and the hair-like roots come down off of it. You can try to divide the roots, the root stock, the rhizome, and replant half of it and take half of it. The problem with that is it doesn't always survive. So usually I don't try to do that unless it's in a controlled environment. Like, for example, when I was growing golden seal in the clinic, I had a terrarium that I was growing golden seal in for several years. And with that, I would try to take half of the root and put the other half back. But if you're doing that in the wild, you're probably going to kill the whole thing, because the part of the rootstock that you put back isn't going to get watered regularly and all that. It's going to kind of be a lot more left to chance than it would be in a controlled cultivation environment. So trying to divide rootstock might end up killing twice as many plants as you wanted to, since you're only getting half of the amount of rootstock from each one. So golden seal is a plant around here that we gather that has a rhizome. Bloodroot is another one. Bloodroot is a traditional Appalachian herb, but it's not necessarily a good do-it-yourself kind of medicine. So gathering anything like that, I usually would just take the whole plant and take not more than 1 in 10 plants. And usually, realistically, I'm trying to find a place where I'm maybe taking closer to 1 in 100, because I would like to find a very large stand that has way more than what I need, and take, you know, a small portion of it rather than finding a smaller stand and taking 1/10 of it, which is about the maximum that the stand could possibly bear. So if you're taking that much, you actually are putting some pressure on the stand for survival, but it's not, you know, usually 1 in 10 is something that most plants could bear. There are some environmentally sensitive plants that you just kind of need to stay away from that can't bear that level of harvesting. Lady slipper is a classic example. It's an orchid that grows in the woods here. It's very, very selective about the habitat that it grows in. It needs certain type of soil. It needs certain fungus attached to certain trees that it kind of is in communication with, that forms part of its support system. So without all of that, it won't grow. And even if it does grow, so there are, you know, relatively few places in the woods that you would find it under ideal circumstances, just because it needs so many things. And even when you have those circumstances, it's a very slow growing plant that can sometimes take 20 years to go from seed to bearing seeds of its own. So from the time it germinates until the time that from the time the seed falls off of one plant until that grows into a seed and that seed grows into a plant, and that plant produces flowers and fruit with more seeds in them, that can be basically a whole human generation. So it's very slow growing. And if you were to harvest 1 in 10 of that every year, you would probably eradicate the stand, because it might not produce that many baby plants in any given year. And so, you know, you might get them all before they manage to produce enough more to replace themselves. So that's you know, a more environmentally sensitive thing. But for most things, including even ginseng, 1 in 10 is pretty reasonable. If you are harvesting roots, you pretty much always want to wait until the plant has borne seed. And with all these things, there are certain times that are the right time to gather them. With leaves, it's a little more flexible, because if the leaves are there, then, you know, you've got mature leaves, and that's the case for a lot of plants. That's the case most of the year. You know, for raspberries, for instance, they start putting out leaves kind of late spring, and the leaves are there basically until close to the end of winter. And you know, you can harvest you can harvest them most months of the year if you really need to. The ones in winter aren't as good, but three seasons out of the year, you can get good quality raspberry leaves. Pine leaves, pine needles, you can get basically all year. Deciduous trees, if you need the leaves from those, they're there most of the year, or depending where you are, maybe half of the year. Flowers, of course, are only going to be there at a certain amount of time, at a certain time. If you're picking violet petals, you want to pick them during the big violet bloom, which lasts for a few weeks in April, or maybe March, or maybe late April or May where you are, depending. Around here, it's usually in April. So all of that is, just kind of a matter of when it's there. With roots, they're there all the time, but you don't want to pick them all the time. You want to pick them when the berries or fruit or whatever it is has gotten ripe, and when the leaves have begun to fade. So for most plants, not every plant is set up like this, but for most plants, they're going to grow, they're going to bloom, and then the leaves are going to die back, and the substances that are in the leaves are going to get stored in the root. So all the medicine is going to be concentrated into the root. And then as that's happening, the fruit is ripening, and the leaves kind of tend to fade when the fruit's ripening, because it's kind of the plant's done for the year. It's done its job of trying to make more of itself. So at that point, you can replant the seeds. If you go and dig ginseng in September or maybe October, you can go and find the berries on the plant and poke holes in the ground with your finger and put those seeds from those berries in the holes and cover them over with dirt, and then come back and in 6 years or so, a small portion of those seeds will have successfully grown into mature plants. And so if you're doing that every time you harvest it, you're helping to ensure the sanctity and the longevity of the stand. And I think that I've told this story before, but there's a stand of ginseng that I harvest from in Bear Track, Kentucky, that I've been harvesting from since 1979. And my family was shown this stand of ginseng by an old man who had been harvesting from it for many years at that point. He was just kind of like, I'm too old to do this anymore, to hike into the woods and get it and everything. So he showed it to my dad, and I harvested it with my dad when I was a little kid, and on my own after that. And so that's kind of longer than most relationships with humans that I've had in my life. Plants are kind of, they'll be there for you if you take care of them. And so with that particular stand, you're doing it in a regenerative way. And that's what you want to do with any plants that you're harvesting. You want to be doing your best to take care of the stand in whatever way you can, which with the roots definitely means replanting the seeds. With other things, it might mean making sure that the stand is preserved. It might mean making sure that the area is not getting damaged by other outside forces. You want to do your best to take care of the plants. The plants will take care of you, and that's kind of the way we've always done things. And I think that that's a good way to do things. I don't think that it needs to be a matter of ownership and property rights and who owns the stand of plants and things like that, which I think is something that some people in the field of sustainable plant production are sort of advocating for these days. Is signing a pledge that you won't use wild plants and so forth. Which, if you were a manufacturer, using wild plants might be kind of sketchy. You don't necessarily know. It might be hard to be sure of where they're coming from and if they're being used in a sustainable way and so forth. But if it's just you, if you're the one doing the harvesting, then you do know, and you can make sure that you're doing it in a really good way. So with roots, you want to take a small amount of them, and also when you're harvesting roots, you want to do your best to make sure that the piece of ground that you took the root from is the same shape that it was before you came along. In other words, don't leave big holes. which is something that I would always see out in the woods in eastern Kentucky, where people would dig ginseng and leave, potholes, lots of little holes in the ground where they dug it up and just tossed the dirt somewhere. Don't do that. Don't do that. It changes the topography of the land in a way that can last for many, many years. And it's also, can be hazardous to animals. There was a law passed out in North Dakota 20 or so years ago about not harvesting echinacea on public lands. And the kind of push behind that law was because people were leaving holes in these fields that the Bureau of Land Management owned. It was federal property. But people also graze animals on those properties. And, people were having cattle break their legs and things like that because people dug holes and left a big hole. And, the actual root that you're taking out of that hole doesn't take up much space. So if you put the dirt back where you got it, then you're not going to be leaving a big hole for some poor hoofed animal to trip on or anything like that. And besides hoofed animals tripping on them, they also can change how water flows in that particular part of the ground, and things like that. And they can change the habitat by doing that. So, that's generally something you want to be conscious of, be careful of anytime that you're disturbing the dirt. You don't want to leave a big patch of bare dirt either. So, you put the leaves back over it so that the rain comes, it's not washing it away. Some of these plants like ginseng or like black and blue cohosh, they tend to grow on slopes. And so if you're, really in the mountains, most things tend to grow on slopes because that's mostly what there is. And so if you are doing things in a way that bears the soil, you want to cover that up the best you can so that soil is not getting washed away down into the streams. Maybe, you just don't want to be disturbing the soil topology and chemistry and water flow and everything like that. So that's something that people might not think of, but it's important that you do think of it if you are trying to have a positive working relationship with a stand of plants. Another category that we have not really touched on as far as plant parts is mushrooms. Mushrooms aren't exactly plants, so they don't really fall into the categories that we talked about, but people harvest them for herbal medicine. And so it's important to be aware of what's going on with that. So the part of the mushrooms that we normally see and interact with are essentially the fruiting bodies of the mushroom. So the rules are a lot like it is for fruits. As far as I'm concerned, it's a good idea to not harvest more than half of them, which is not what a lot of foragers do. A lot of people will find a stand, especially if it's an edible mushroom, and they will gather every single one of them. And some people feel like that's an okay thing to do because the mycelium that it's growing from is still there. The part that you're taking is actually just the reproductive structure, comparable to the flower or fruit of a flowering plant. But like I said before, there might be other animals that are eating these things, other animals that are using them as habitat, invertebrates and so forth, that might be using the mushrooms as habitats or living on or living off of them. And also because those are the reproductive structures, they're what's releasing the spores. And typically we don't eat them after they've gone to spore. We eat them before, or we use them for medicine before they've gone to spore. So if you're harvesting something like reishi, which is a hard shelf fungus that grows out of rotting wood, if you're harvesting something like morels, which is an edible fungus, or chicken of the woods, which is a soft shelf fungus that grows out of trees, I think that it's a really good idea to leave some of it there so that it can go to spore and produce more in that area in the years to come. And also so that other animals that eat it, that maybe, can't go to the grocery store the way that you can, also get their share. So even though they're really neat things and you might want to gather as much of it as you can, I would encourage everybody not to do that. Not to take all that there is of mushroom fruiting bodies, but just to take, maybe half at the most, and leave the rest for the fungal community to propagate itself, as well as for the animals that rely on them to have some as well. Yeah. So, and then the other thing that's kind of a side note, but you don't want to take anything that you're not prepared to deal with. So before you harvest something, you have to have a plan for what's going to happen after you harvest it. So that you don't just harvest a bunch of stuff and then have it go bad on you. You want to have a plan for, how am I going to dry the leaves that I go out and harvest today? If I'm going to dry, a bunch of nettles, for instance, I want to make sure I've got space to spread them out so that they can dry evenly and not mold, because otherwise I'm being wasteful if I harvest them and let them go bad. So, I kind of think of wasting medicinal herbs as almost being like a taboo, something that would be not exactly bad luck, but misfortunate thing to do, something that would, be needlessly costful to the environment and harmful, and kind of make you sad as well. So it's a really good idea to kind of have a plan for where you're going to go with things. How you're going to harvest, how you're going to dry it and process it, and what you're going to use it for, so that you're not taking more than you need and you're not taking more than you can handle. And that's a really important consideration with harvesting in a sustainable and regenerative and cooperative with the environment sort of way. So I hope that all of you will work on harvesting things, and kind of develop a practice of wildcrafting along with your practice of healing, because I think it's one of the best ways to make your herbal practice self-sustaining, and make it something that you can continue doing. Because I think a lot of the people who have the experience of dabbling in herbal medicine might try some stuff, but they end up buying a bunch of supplies and making some things and then not really using it, and so forth. And that can be a reason to stop doing it. People would be like, oh, I made all this and then I never used it and it went bad, and it just ended up feeling frivolous. And you're less likely to do that with plants you harvest yourself, I think, because the work that goes into them, and it just feels different to have a pound of nettles that you gathered from the woods versus a pound of nettles that you bought from the store or ordered from Frontier or whatever. And so it connects you with the sacredness of it. It connects you with the living source of the medicine, and it also, is a way for you to be in control of the entire process of the production, from the time that it's a plant growing in the ground till the time that it's something that you give to the person that you're trying to help. So that there's a sort of chain of custody. There's a sort of responsibility for the whole process that you have, which is a quality control issue, and also a way for you to maybe be more in your power as an herbalist, maybe be more capable with every step of the process, and less dependent on any sort of outside forces that could be disrupted. So I really strongly encourage everybody. I think that if I had not started out as a forager, as someone who gathered my own medicine, I don't think that I ever would have really made it as an herbalist, because just the cost burden of buying the herbs and the disconnection that creates with the actual plants and so forth, I think probably would have added up to being a deal breaker. And I think that that's something that is different for me than for a lot of other herbalists, and different in terms of what sort of outcomes I've had from being an herbalist compared to what a lot of other people have. So it's a really key part of the process as far as I'm concerned, as far as my philosophy of herbal medicine goes. So, another thing to consider is, especially with plants that grow in sensitive habitats, you want to be considerate of how you might be disrupting the habitat by being there, by going in and out of it. This is especially apparent if you're talking about, for instance, a wetland. There aren't a lot of wetland plants that are great do-it-yourself herbal medicines, but horsetail is one that kind of is, and it is pretty widely used and so forth. If you're going to somewhere to gather horsetail, you're probably going to be walking through mud. If you're walking through mud, you're probably going to be leaving footprints. If you're doing this with 3 or 4 other people, you could be stirring up a lot of, you could be making a big mess just walking in and out of the place. So you have to try not to. You have to be careful. And this is true with plants. It's true with just about any plant that grows in wetlands. It's also true of plants in some other habitats. For example, if you're in a tall meadow, it's hard to walk in and out of the tall meadow without leaving a swath that you've kind of carved through it, which, you may have to do that. You may have to walk in and, trample some stuff down as you're getting to the plants you need, but you want to try and keep it to a minimum. You want it to, the ideal, of course, is to leave no trace. You definitely don't want to leave any matter behind, any, beer cans or anything like that. But even beyond that, it's best to leave not even footprints if you can manage it, or as few as possible. So kind of try and move through habitats where you're going to be tramping things down or leaving muddy footprints or anything like that in as efficient a way as possible, and with a regard for the fact that you're impacting the environment by moving in and out of it, by moving material in and out of it, and so forth. Don't just drive the truck into the middle of the meadow and then start picking things. Try and park the truck somewhere where you're not crushing a bunch of stuff, and then just walk in and out in a straight line, that sort of thing. May seem minor, but it can really make a difference, especially if you're not the only one gathering from an area, or if you're going there frequently. So, I definitely know of places in the woods where there are tire tracks, or sort of not quite roads, but ruts at least, where people have driven in and out, and that they haven't gone there that much. Logging trails, the national forest is full of logging trails that are, not really maintained or anything. And some of them have some positive effects, animals move up and down them as well. But you don't want to be creating a lot of that sort of thing as you're going in and out of the woods to get plants. So, don't go in with a machete and cut everything down unless you absolutely have to. And you probably don't ever absolutely have to. I can't think of a single time when I've needed to bushwhack my way to a plant with a machete. So, walk carefully in the woods. Respect the plants that you're walking over to get to the plants that you're harvesting, as well as you're respecting the plants that you're harvesting, and that sort of thing. And then another thing that I want to say about harvesting plants is you have to be careful with your own self when you're doing it. It can be dangerous to be out among animals. There's snakes, maybe there's bears, maybe there's people. You want to be careful that anywhere that you're going is a safe place for you to be. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that wild plants belong to anyone, but if you're on someone's property and they don't want you to be there, that can be dangerous. Lead to anything from hassles to being shot. So that's definitely something to be aware of. And I don't know how it is everywhere else, but I know here in this part of the world, people are really very sympathetic to people shooting ginseng poachers. I remember speaking at a gathering of people who were interested in non-timber forestry products, and I mentioned that I'd read in the paper that morning that 2 people had been shot digging ginseng off of someone else's land, and everyone stood up and clapped. They thought that it was great. They thought that was just the best news that they'd heard all day. And I was kind of surprised by that, but it's definitely a prevailing attitude. So you don't want to be gathering stuff from people's land without them knowing about it. You don't want to, necessarily put yourself in a dangerous situation like that. So that's, something to be aware of. And then just, if you're not used to being out in the wilderness and you are going out in the wilderness, you want to over prepare rather than under prepare. Just like going there for any other activity, make sure you've got plenty of water, make sure you've got protection from the sun, be careful of ticks, everything like that. There's a lot of potential hazards out there. So, keeping yourself safe is a really important thing that often doesn't get brought up in this type of discussion, but I think it is important. Yeah, I think that Gretchen mentions taking the kids out and showing them plants that were growing in the backyard when they were little, and I think that that's a great thing to do if you have kids in your life, whether they're yours or someone else's. Introducing people to just a few simple plants that live where you live can really be a life-changing thing. We live in such a consumerized culture where everybody's access to everything is based around buying it, that the idea that there's plants that have uses and potential impacts and names and characteristics and everything that are just growing quite irrespective of any sort of supply and demand in everybody's backyard is a really kind of dramatic shift from the way people are used to thinking of how the world works. So I think that that's something that's really good to do if you get a chance to, if you have people in your life who are younger people, or even just people who haven't been exposed to these ideas before. Learn the flowers and teach them to somebody else, and it can make a big difference in somebody's life, and they'll often remember it all those years later when they're adults and things like that. So it's a really nice, very human type of activity. Yeah, so let's see. So another category that I didn't mention, but it kind of goes along with the same characteristics as bark, is that there are some woods that are used medicinally as well, where the actual wood of the plant is used medicinally. And if you were gathering something like that, you would do it pretty much the way that I described for bark. You would either take a branch or you would take a whole small tree. It's worth noting with bark that sometimes trees have more than one type of bark. They always have more than one layer of bark pretty much, but sometimes you want the inner bark exclusively and not the harder outer bark. But there are a lot of them, like for example with cherry, the bark that grows on small trees or small branches is not the same as the bark that grows on the trunk of a big tree. On the trunk of a big tree, it's this crackly, thick, got a thick layer of cork to it. And on the branches or smaller trunks, it's like a smooth, shiny thing that's almost like almost like birch bark, except it's gray instead of white, and silvery gray. And so it's like two very different barks, and the thick hard stuff doesn't have nearly as much of the glycosides and organic compound, the glycosides and aromatic compounds in it that make it work as a cough suppressant, as you know, the crackly bark doesn't have that, the smooth bark does. So same with pine, you know, it has an inner layer of bark that's the same all over the tree, but the outer bark is different on small branches than it is on the thick parts of the trunk. As it grows, it just develops a thicker and thicker layer of I guess you could call it dead cells or cork, or you know, tissue that's not very, doesn't have a lot of biological processes going on in it. It's just sort of structural or protective, and that part tends not to have a lot of the medicine in it in most cases. So I wanted to talk about a couple of herbs, as always. Yeah, Kim mentions pawpaw roots and bark. I haven't really used them either. I think that's interesting. The fruit, of course, is well known, and I use that medicinally as well as for food. But I haven't really done much with the roots or bark or the flowers, which are very interesting. I'm sure they have some compounds that are not common in the plant world. They're very, very alien looking and strange smelling and everything. But I haven't really used them or known anyone who has used them for medicine. But yeah, it's really fascinating to look at the plants that are around you throughout the year and see how they change, or in some cases how they don't change. And that's why one reason why I wanted to do this as a year-long course rather than any other length of time was because, you know, that gives us a full cycle of plant growth for everybody to go out, you know, and see. Of course, we'll do the herb walks, but also just for you to go out into your environment, your yard, parks near your house, or whatever is around you where there are plants, and see what's growing there and see how it changes over time. It is a really, I think for anybody, it's a really life-changing thing to connect with the plants that are growing around you. And I think if you're going to be an herbalist, it's really a game changer. It's really something that's changes your abilities, something that empowers you, something that gives you a whole different set of strategies that you can use in being an herbalist compared to if you didn't have that direct connection to the plants. Yeah, pawpaw is big in anti-cancer research. There are compounds in pawpaws and related plants that destroy cancer cells, and they have a tradition of use for that as well. And so it's you know, it's an area that people are kind of looking into right now. Of course, they always look into these things as they have a very drug-like perspective on how it should work. So that's something that doesn't always yield them the right answers. You know, sometimes if you can't use things the way a drug would be used, they don't really understand how to look at it. But yeah, it's a fascinating plant, and it's got some really neat compounds in it, and it can be used as a poultice on sores and things like that. It's got a lot of sores and burns. Got some good uses as far as that sort of thing goes. So as far as individual herbs, one of the herbs that I want to talk about right now, because it's getting ready to happen, all over the Northern Hemisphere. Well, maybe not all over the Northern Hemisphere, but in my area and in lots of other places throughout the temperate zones of the Northern Hemisphere, which is black walnut. And there's other kinds of walnut too. And most of what I'm going to say applies to some degree or another to other walnuts besides black walnut. But hang on just a second. Black walnut is it's a very large tree. Juglans nigra is the Latin name. Species name just means black. Juglans is the walnut genus. And it is a compound word consisting of Jul, which is Jove or Jupiter, and glans, which is acorn. And so they're like Jupiter's acorns, although acorns are also kind of associated with Jupiter themselves. So it's kind of a weird name, but yeah, they're like were considered to be associated with Jove or Jupiter, the Roman father of the gods, and they have a lot of they have a long, well, that would not be our American walnut species. That would be, you know, originally would have been the walnuts that grow in Persia and in Europe. But walnuts they're large trees. They're long lived. They have very hard wood. That's, you know, kind of a sought after wood. It's what a lot of well, cabinets and rifle stocks and sometimes tool handles and other things are made out of it. It's a very dark colored wood. So it's a lumber tree. People grow them to cut them down. And here in the city, it's a very common tree, which kind of surprises me because it drops a lot of stuff. But it's a very common tree that people have planted around the city. And the main reason that it became a popular tree for planting in town is that the leaves come on late and they fall off early. So it's a shade tree in the summer, but it allows the light in the winter. So if you have it, you know, in front of your house, it'll allow sun to be coming in your windows during the colder parts of the year, but it will provide more shade during the summer months. So that was kind of and of course they get to be big trees pretty quickly. That was kind of the main justification for planting them when they were a popular landscaping tree. And I think in more recent times, you know, you're not really supposed to plant them as street trees or anything because they drop a lot of walnuts. And walnut is sometimes, it's a nut. The fruit is sometimes considered a drupe or like a stone fruit, basically, because it's got a softer outer layer and then it's got the hard nut inside. The shell, which is very hard, and then the nut, which is inside the shell, the nut meat, which is just sort of like any other walnut. But the part that's most used in herbal medicine is the green hull. So people will describe them as green black walnut hulls, which is a little bit confusing because it has two color names right in a row. But green hulls from black walnuts. These they have a variety of uses. They contain some aromatic substances, especially one called juglone, which has a really interesting smell, a distinctive smell to it. That if you rub, if you find a green black walnut and you rub it between your fingers or your hands and you smell it, it has this really nice distinctive smell to it. And then they contain conjugated tannins, which are acids that are dark colored. There's gallic acid, tannic acid, gallotannic acid, and conjugated tannic acid, which are all variations and repetitions of the same molecule, but it has a lot of medicinal properties. And it's responsible for most of the medicinal properties of walnut. A lot of the time now, when people use walnut or when you see walnut recommended, it's as an anti-parasitic, and it's good for that. It will kill parasites. It will actually kill a lot of things. when the nuts fall on the ground, they'll often keep a lot of other plants and worms and things like that from living in that area. So, it inhibits a lot of other plant growth and also some invertebrates as well. And people have taken black walnut hull internally to get rid of worms, especially worms in the digestive tract, but also some worms not in the digestive tract, like flukes. You don't really see flukes much in our environment. They have kind of a complicated life cycle where they live part of their life in grazing animals and part outside of them. And I don't know the whole deal, but you kind of have to have unsanitary living conditions for both people and animals right together for them to become a common thing. But in the late 80s and 90s, there was a series of popular books that really made black walnut hull a very popular herbal medicine. And the first book in this series was called The Cure for All Diseases. And the premise behind it was that all diseases were caused by parasites, and that if you took a combination of black walnut and I think cloves and wormwood, all of which are anti-parasitic herbs, and then also shocked yourself with a little galvanometer. People called it a bug zapper, but shocked yourself with this little electrical device that would cure all diseases. It doesn't really cure all diseases, but I don't think it actually cures very many diseases at all. But it was an immensely popular book. And you wouldn't think a book like The Cure for All Diseases would have a sequel or would need a sequel, but it did. There was The Cure for All Diseases, and then part 2 was The Cure for All Cancers, and then part 3 was The Cure for Advanced Cancers, which kind of seems like fewer and fewer diseases, right? But anyway, the recommendations were pretty similar throughout the whole series. And these were immensely popular at the time, and just immensely stupid. Like they didn't stand up to any critical thinking at all, but they had an enormous influence on the alternative health world at the time that unfortunately continues up to the present day. So you may hear about some of that when you're working with people, and you may hear about black walnut hulls in that context. But even apart from that, that's not where the origin was of black walnut being used as an anti-parasitic. It really does work as an anti-parasitic. It's just that in adults, parasites are usually a secondary issue. Like little kids get pinworms, and sometimes they cause a clinically significant disruption to their digestion. It can cause gas, bloating, itching around the anus, things like that. Usually nothing dangerous in an otherwise healthy child, but they can be noticeable. And black walnut is a reasonable thing to give to kids. It's plenty safe enough for them. But in adults, if somebody is getting pinworms, it's usually because they're constipated. I mean, we're all exposed to pinworms on a fairly regular basis, probably. They're a common organism in the environment, in the human population as well. But usually in an adult, they don't really take hold enough to cause any kind of problems the way that they do in some children. But there was definitely sort of a trend of kind of blaming parasites for everything. Other parasites are kind of similar, to what I said about flukes. Most of them have complicated life cycles. And depending on where you are, there are some other parasites that are borne by mosquito bites and things like that. So parasites are definitely a real thing, but they've kind of been mythologized in the alternative health world, to the point where a lot of the time if you start talking about parasites, people might think that you're, into some really weird conspiracy theories or something like that that aren't necessarily implied just by the existence of parasites. So all that being said, be prepared for that if you ever need to talk to anybody about parasites. But that being said, black walnut is a really good basic herb for dealing with parasites, for killing off intestinal parasites like pinworms. And to a lesser extent, something that you could use for a systematic parasite like filaria or wuchereria, which is a very tiny worm that gets into you through a mosquito bite. But we don't really have that around here so far. We may get it if global warming keeps up long enough, but it's something that you would more get in Central and South America, in parts of Central and South America, where it's warmer, kind of a tropical thing. But so black walnut is something that you could use in that situation. Also internally, black walnut will really slow down diarrhea. If somebody's having diarrhea that's bad enough that that you're worried about them losing weight, getting dehydrated, things like that, black walnut, just through its astringent action on the inside of the intestines, it will actually kind of like tighten up the tissue that's releasing fluid into the intestines and slow that down. Similar to what I said last time about raspberry bark, similar substances involved, in fact. So it's pretty good for that. I have used it that way along with other herbs to treat whatever was causing the diarrhea, ideally. But like one of the earlier times that I was really in a medical support position for a group of people was at a rainbow gathering in 1992, and several of the people there got diarrhea from drinking bad water. And so I was using black walnut as one of the things that I was using for that, just to kind of make it less uncomfortable and also slow the spread of it, potential spread of it to other people, by making it so that people's bowel movements were more controllable, basically. And so, you know, it's a useful herb for that. And the anti-parasitic effect and the anti-diarrheal effects are basically the two main things that I would foresee using that for in like as an internal medicine. It has lots of other topical uses. Just a second. The lights start to get low, so I'm going to step into the medicine wagon and plug in. Just a second. Dun, 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 dun. There we go. Let's see how I do this. All right, I think that's going to work for now. So topically, black walnut is an astringent, just like it is internally, but it's astringent and disinfectant. So it's kind of almost like, it reminds people of iodine because it's dark brown and it stains what it touches and it kills germs. It's not iodine, and it doesn't contain iodine, but it can work kind of similarly for disinfecting wounds. And for like, when you disinfect a wound with black walnut, it kind of has a lasting effect. It doesn't just kill the germs that are there right now, and then new ones can start immediately. It sort of leaves behind a residue that is antibacterial and antifungal, and so it can be a good way to treat a wound that you don't want to that you're trying to keep from getting infected, or that you are cleaning out. So this is a little bit gross, maybe, but I've used black walnut tincture to irrigate sores that had kind of started to be necrotic or started to slough tissue because the tissue was dying, and it's pretty much helpful for that. And you can use it, and it'll have sort of a more lasting effect than just if you were to just clean it out with soap and water, or even if you were to clean it out with, say, thyme extract or something like that. That would have a different type of might have a more dramatic antibacterial effect in the short term, but won't have the staying power. So sometimes it's good to do two things, do a couple of things, use a couple of substances to rinse out a wound like that. But black walnut is a good thing to have in the rotation for that, because it's it's really useful and kind of treats the wound in a way that lasts for a while. It does stain the skin though, and that staining can last for several days. So something to be aware of as far as the cosmetic aspect of it goes. There used to be an herbalist who lived here in Lexington named Crazy Owl, and he was primarily a Chinese herbalist. He also had a PhD in mathematics, I think it was, but he was a really fascinating guy. But he had used it a lot for men's sexual health, which was something that he kind of specialized in a little bit. And he was using very small, like drop doses of it sublingually for things like impotence and prostatic hyperplasia, where the prostate's swollen and, which makes it difficult to urinate. So he was actually using it in those kinds of situations, apparently, with a lot of success. I never have used it in that capacity myself, but he was very experienced, and he had apparently used it that way quite a bit. So that's another aspect to it. And a lot of these herbs, I'm sharing about how I use them, but with a lot of them, they have other uses that aren't necessarily what I'm familiar with for them, because all of them, it's important to remember, contain not just one or two substances that make them do what they do, but hundreds or maybe even thousands of them. And so, in this case, I don't know exactly what it was that did that, or what it was that has an effect on the male reproductive system like that, but apparently it has got some effect. Yeah. Crazy Owl kept all his, he made honey extracts of all his herbs. Well, most of them anyway. Used a lot of local stuff, as well as a lot of Chinese formulas. Yeah, black walnut is, like I said, something that you can gather an enormous amount of pretty easily. So in a few weeks here, the black walnut trees will start dropping these hulls, these nuts inside of hulls. They look like little green tennis balls. And they stain the road when they fall on the road, and eventually they turn brown. Actually, not eventually, pretty quickly they start to turn brown. And when you cut them, they'll probably turn brown unless you have a situation set up where they're going to dry very quickly. And then it is possible to dry them while they're still green, but they tend to oxidize and turn brown pretty quickly and pretty strongly. And when you make a tincture of them, it will be a very, very dark brown, like an inky dark brown. I have used a water-based extract of it because the stuff that's in them is mostly soluble in water. I've used a water-based extract of it as an ink and as a fabric dye, and also to tan leather. But usually I make a tincture of it for medicinal purposes. But it's so what you want to do if you're doing that is gather a bunch of these round green balls and either slice or smash the pulpy green part off of them, off of the outside of them, and then you can leave the rest of the nut. You can leave it out for the squirrels, or you can let it sit for a while until the whole outer part is kind of brown and soft and comes off easily, and then break them open and harvest the nuts out of the middle of them. If you need oil, if you were trying to produce your own oil for any sort of medicine making purposes, black walnut is the easiest to harvest oilseed crop in my bioregion, with hickory nuts being a somewhat close second. But it's a very easy thing to break up and crush the nuts and get the oil out of them. And I use it for a lot of different things, mostly for food, but for some salves as well. The oil is just a little tiny bit astringent. And if you want, you can actually dry the hulls and then soak them in the oil. And some of the conjugated tannins will come out in the oil as well, even though they're mostly water soluble, and you can have a slightly astringent oil infusion. And so that's another way that you can use black walnuts medicinally. And that's an astringent oil, which you can use that to clean and tighten pores in the face. Although if you use very much of it, it can stain. You can also use it on minor injuries as a sort of a disinfectant and to create a barrier between the injured tissue and the environment. So that's another good thing to know about black walnut. Just a second. All right, so yes, so I was going to say, when you're harvesting black walnut, you might want to consider wearing gloves. You might want to consider having some sort of a vinyl tablecloth down if you're working on a table or working on them outside or something, because they do stain things, and the stain does not come out easily from anything. If it's on your skin, it will fade over the course of days. If it's on fabric, it may or may not come out. If it's on wood, it's pretty much going to stay there. You can get the stain out of wood with borax, but it stains everything. It's very messy, so that's something to be aware of. But it's a really fun herb to work with because you put it in the alcohol or the whatever, and you can really see the color diffusing from the plant material into the liquid pretty quickly, and see a dramatic change in the color of the substance that it makes, the color of the medicine, and so forth. So it's a really good, a really fun instructional herb to work with, but also really messy. And so another herb that I wanted to talk about a little bit is comfrey. Comfrey is sort of, let's see, I guess people would say is controversial. There are different kinds of comfrey, and all comfreys contain these substances called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And lots of other plants contain pyrrolizidine alkaloids too. Some pyrrolizidine alkaloids are toxic, and some of them are less so or not at all so. Comfrey does tend to contain a little bit, and sometimes more than a little bit, depending on the variety of toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids. These same alkaloids are probably part of what makes it medicinal. We're going to talk a little bit about what people use comfrey for, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what problems it can cause. So the traditional use of comfrey is mostly for wound healing. Comfrey leaves crushed up have been used as a poultice on wounds, and even on wounds where there's internal damage, like broken bones, for instance, where there's not anything that's going to be directly in contact with the plant, but deeper into the tissue. And the traditional understanding is that comfrey helps these things to heal faster. I don't really have a good mechanism of action that I could propose through which comfrey would be able to do that. Speaking from experience, it does seem like it does help. Like it does seem like it speeds up healing, but I'm of broken bones and of things that are deeper than the surface, but I'm not sure how that could be exactly. So besides using it as a poultice of the crushed up leaves, it's also used as an oil infusion or a salve. I talked about, making a comfrey salve before, which would be made by cooking the dried leaves or cooking the leaves until they become dry in oil, and then straining the leaf material out and adding beeswax or some other kind of wax to the oil so that it will harden when it cools. And that's kind of the basic process for making a salve, which next time we'll talk more about making salves and oil infusions. But that's the general idea. And so this salve is used for the same type of thing, for healing, and maybe more for surface area type of healing compared to the poultice. The FDA suggests that nobody use comfrey for anything that involves broken skin. There really isn't any known, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any known clinical cases of comfrey being applied to the skin causing any sort of problems. It's more of a hypothetical thing that some of what's in it could get into your system and cause problems. But the idea with applying comfrey to a wound is that it speeds up the process of healing. It speeds up the creation of new cells, which grow over the wound. The problem with comfrey is that there have been a few cases, and these few cases happened at a time when comfrey was a big fad and thousands of people were consuming comfrey tea on a daily basis. There have been a few cases of people who have had very bad liver damage of the sort that is caused by pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which we know what that looks like partly from livestock eating other plants that contain these things. But it causes a situation called hepatic veno-occlusive disease, where inside the liver, the same cell proliferation happens, but instead of covering over a wound, it's covering over openings of blood vessels. So you end up with blood vessels where the epithelium inside the blood vessel has grown over the opening, so that the blood vessel is no longer able to transmit blood, to carry blood, and so that becomes that destroys the tissue around it essentially. So that's something that can lead to liver damage and liver failure. So generally speaking, if you look into comfrey in anything modern, they'll say, don't use this internally under any circumstances, and that's why. So some people pay attention to that, and some people don't. Most modern herbalists would tell you that they do not ever recommend comfrey internally. So yeah, the question is if that was only the wrong sort of comfrey. Possibly so. So a lot of comfrey that you can get if you buy it at the store, buy it from a nursery or whatever, is a hybrid. It's the genus name is Symphydum. There's Symphydum officinalis is the medicinal comfrey, the usual comfrey. There's Uplandicum, which is Russian comfrey, and then there's a hybrid of the two. And it's possible that the kind of white-rooted Uplandicum and or the hybrids were responsible for most of the actual clinical stuff that happened. The trouble with the real comfrey is that it's very invasive to your garden, and so it became after the mid 20th century, it became pretty unpopular as a garden plant because it's so invasive and it will take over a flower bed or a garden bed. Whereas the Uplandicum will basically stay where you put it, and the hybrid will stay where you put it, and it won't produce any fertile seeds. So it's quite possible that when people were having problems, it was because they were using a different sort of comfrey than what had traditionally been used, although that's never actually been proven. It's a speculation that, I think is a fairly reasonable speculation, but I cannot guarantee it. And so, where I'm from, people eat comfrey, people grow comfrey. It's one of the main non-native medicinal plants that people cultivate. Just about every old-fashioned house in Eastern Kentucky would have a patch of comfrey growing out front, and people would use it on all sorts of wounds and things like that. People also cook the greens when they're small and eat them. I don't like the greens for food because they're sandpapery, but I can't bring myself to be afraid of them either because, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like finding out that macaroni and cheese causes heart disease or something like that. I accept that it's the case, but I don't necessarily feel very worried by it. I don't use comfrey internally in my clinical practice. I do use it externally. I do sometimes use it on abraded skin, not really on open wounds in the sense of deeper wounds, but on scrapes. I think that there is little to no chance of a clinically significant amount of pyrrolizidine alkaloids, even if they were present in the plant, getting back into the bloodstream and being able to do any harm. I think that's a pretty out there scenario. So I do still use it in that capacity, but it's an herb that there's kind of a lot of strong feelings about and a lot of controversy about. And most of the science that's been done on it is pretty much in agreement that, at least some of the time, comfrey contains these pyrrolizidine alkaloids that can be toxic. And at least some of the time, a small percentage of the time, if people take those alkaloids into their system as food or as a beverage or whatever, that it can cause problems. So that's kind of the story on that. It's both the root and the leaves are used medicinally. I mostly use the leaves because the plant will produce kind of an endless supply of them. If you have a very aggressive variety of it, then using the roots as well can be a way to eradicate some of it and keep it from growing as much. So people have always made stuff out of the roots, and a lot of the time the stuff that's made out of the roots, it contains a substance called allantoin, which is very much researched as a skincare component, a skincare ingredient. And so if you make an oil infusion of the roots of comfrey, or you can make it as a tea too, a regular water infusion, that's something that helps. The idea is that it helps to keep wrinkles from forming in the skin, helps to basically helps the skin cells regenerate themselves in a way so that your skin doesn't look thin and crepe-like, but more like it does when you're younger. And so that's called allantoin is the substance, and it's in a lot of things. It's a very it's not only found in comfrey, but it's also a very widely used ingredient in skincare products. And and one that you can source yourself if you grow comfrey. There's also a plant here in Kentucky and here in the eastern United States called wild comfrey, which is not a wild version of the comfrey plant. It's just like kind of a completely separate plant. So that's something to be aware of if you encounter that plant. It does have some similar uses, particularly for being used as a poultice on wounds, but it is not, in spite of the name, it is not a wild version of the same plant as comfrey. Did I say allantoin was only in the roots? No, not necessarily only in the roots, but there's more of it in the roots. I think a higher concentration, and I believe a much higher concentration in the roots than in the rest of the plant. So that's on the whole, I consider comfrey to be a pretty useful plant, but it is something, and it's not the sort of situation where if somebody drinks a cup of comfrey tea that they're going to fall over dead. That's never been the issue, and so the fact that that's not what happens doesn't mean that the issue isn't real. It's just that it's more a matter of cumulative damage from repeated use that's what people have to worry about. So I'm just trying to move this around. Okay, so I'm not staring directly into a light because it's getting a little harsh on my eyes. So yeah, if you want to grow comfrey, I suggest growing it in a container, because it does the good stuff, the real stuff, does tend to propagate itself, does tend to grow a lot. And if you try to dig it up and you leave a tiny piece of the root in the ground, it can grow from the root as well. It's better at that than most other plants. So it's something that you can sometimes find where houses used to be, because the comfrey is still growing even though the house is gone now. That kind of a plant, and of which there are a few that you'll often find around old house sites here. So yeah, comfrey is I don't know. It's a cultural plant. It's a culturally significant plant here in Kentucky, and it is kind of much maligned as well as much made excuses for, both unfairly some of the time. So I think that's something that I want all of you to be aware of, all of you to just kind of know about. And like I said, I don't really feel a lot of fear or apprehension around using it at all, but I do think that it is something that has to be used with respect and not recklessly, because the thing with hepatocclusive disease, veno-occlusive hepatic disease, is real and is something that you have to be aware of, and not put people in the position where that's likely to happen to them, or possible even to happen to them. Yeah, the Amish use it a lot, and I believe that it was one of the ingredients in the salve that we had an Amish herbalist here in Kentucky that went to prison for a few years for the way that he was marketing his salves, basically. And I believe that he was using comfrey in some of them, although that wasn't really the issue of why he got in trouble. But it's a good herb. It's not necessarily a perfectly safe herb either, but it is not necessarily useless or something that people have to be really worried about. So I think that that's how I feel about a lot of things in herbal medicine, is that people tend to take sometimes extreme views about whether an herb is good or not, or how good it is and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of the time things are overhyped by people who are trying to sell them, and a lot of the time things are villainized by people who are trying to sell something else, or trying to or just have some sort of prejudice against them. And it can be difficult to separate those things out when you don't have all the facts. So I'm trying to provide some critical perspective as far as that goes. All right, any questions about either of those herbs? All right. Let's see. I have not necessarily picked a date yet, but I want to do the next plant walk in August. So in a little more than a month from now is when I'm hoping to do the next of the seasonal plant walks. We should have, pretty different stuff up and blooming compared to what we had at the end of May by that time. And I'd like to also go to a slightly different type of habitat this time, so that we can see some different types of plants growing there. So I'll be hopefully by next time I'll have that all planned out for us. And will probably be the first or second weekend in August. And we can kind of go and see some more plants, and look at what's growing, and talk about what to do with it. And hopefully that will be a good time for that. All right. Okay. All right. Well, that's about all I have for right now. If anybody has any questions, let me know. And if you think of any later, feel free to email me. And also, as always, thanks to everybody who made a contribution this week. I very much appreciate it. And I will, happy new moon, everybody. And I will talk to you all again soon.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.